Hello everyone. So today I wanted to address another question that had been asked on a different video that I had done. And that question was sort of just asking me to get into discussing hinds, deer, in the context of fairies. So I decided, instead of just kind of digging into that topic, that I would do a quick video sort of looking at the intersection of fairies and animals, because that's a very complicated topic, and I'm sure I've touched a tiny bit on it in the past, particularly when talking about physical forms and shapes of fairies as shapeshifters, certain types of fairies that take on specific forms, and etc. However, it definitely does deserve a video of its own. So when we are looking at the topic of fairy animals, there are sort of two categories that we're really discussing here, for the most part. And much like everything else on this topic, to begin, be clear that there's a lot of overlap and sort of vague boundaries between various things related to this topic. So sometimes things aren't clear cut. Sometimes things can sort of belong to different categories or shift back and forth. For our purposes here, I'm going to try to keep this fairly simplified and straightforward. But just keep in mind that there's a lot more nuances to some of this than I'm going to be touching on here. When we're looking at the topic, there's two main categories that we're going to be focusing on here. And those are fairies that take the shapes of animals and animals that exist in the world of fairy. And those are two different things. When we're talking about a fairy being who takes the shape of an animal, generally what we're implying with that is a degree of intelligence and sentience that would be on par with what we would expect from a human. And we all know I hate the whole anthropocentrism, so I'm not in any way meaning to imply that other types of animals in the human world or elsewhere are not sentient or intelligent, but it's more the equivalency. We're talking about fairies that would have an ability to communicate in languages that we understand usually, or at least, clear, distinct languages. Fairies that are able to intelligently and purposefully interact with us. Basically fairies that have that equivalent to what we'd expect or exceeds what we would expect from humans, which could be a really low bar in some cases. That all said, when we're talking about animals that exist in the fairy realm, they're usually analogs to animals that exist in the human world. So when you look at fairy lore, when you look at folklore, and you see stories or myths of people who have traveled or journeyed into fairy, into Ansiel, into the other world by any name, you will find references to what are clearly that world equivalent to animals that we would have here. One example that springs to mind, this is from mythology, but there's descriptions of Shanbroga, Newgrange in English, which is it's a fairy mound, it's the home of Angus Mac and Och. When it's described, it talks about having these pigs that can be killed and then come back to life. It talks about having apple trees. It talks about various other things that live and exist there. When we hear people discussing Manannan's realm and Avlach, we see this same concept there. Descriptions of birds, descriptions of fish, descriptions of different sorts of animals that we would expect to see here in our human world, but in that case they are fairy. They exist in the world of fairy. They're not human animals. And in some cases we see these animals from fairy sort of escaping out into the human world and usually causing destruction or wreaking havoc because they don't belong here. They're not animals that are meant to be here. There's quite a few stories of onagach. Oh, my mind just totally blanked on the English. At Cruachan, the Morrigan's Cave, Cave of Cats, there we go. Onagach, the Cave of Cats at Samhain and at other points would open, and certain specific types of animals. Pigs would come out and sort of destroy the land, couldn't be fought, the heroes had to deal with it. Birds that would also destroy the land, monstrous cats, hence the name of the cave, things like that. And these are all beings of fairy, animals of fairy, who would come out, and they act pretty much the way we would expect human world animals to act, except they aren't. They aren't human animals. Hence why they're so difficult to kill or to deal with, and why they can cause these sort of magical blights on crops and sort of destruction on a scale we wouldn't see with human animals, usually. Human world animals, I should say. So that's sort of one thing. And the reason it's important to differentiate this is, as I just explained, when we're talking about what is simply an animal that is from fairy, whether it's in fairy or has wandered into our world, it's still going to pretty much do what we would expect a pig to do, or a bird to do, or a cat to do. It doesn't have that extra level of intelligence. I'm not sure quite else how to phrase this, but I do feel like I'm making this sound too much like we're measuring everything against humans, which I'm not trying to, but there you go. They're still just, that type of animal. They just happen to come from fairy and have magical qualities to them. Now, in contrast to that, we do also have some types of animals, fairy animals, or fairies that are shapeshifted into animals that are different. And this is where the water gets a little muddy, because trying to decide whether it's just an animal from fairy or not can sometimes get a little confusing. Now, in some cases, we do know there's some clarity in that this being is able to communicate, that it takes actions that you would not expect that animal to take. It seems to have that extra level of canniness to it. So when we're looking at all of this, and I'm going to go through just a list of some examples, some fall into one category, some fall into the other. We've already sort of in previous cases discussed, for example, the puka. Puka is a type of fairy, or possibly ghost, that's sort of an open question, but for our purposes here, we'll just say it's a type of fairy that can take on multiple different forms. It can appear as a human-seeming, usually older, kind of wrinkled man. It can also appear as a goat, as a pony, as a bird. It has a variety of forms. It's sort of a true shapeshifter. So that would be an example of a fairy who can sort of voluntarily shapeshift into multiple different animal forms. And I keep emphasizing that because I am going to give a list of specific animals, but I think it's too easy to fall into this mindset of it can only be a fairy animal if it's X, or it can only be a fairy shape-shifted into an animal form if it's this specific type of animal. And it's true in folklore and mythology, we do have sort of specific ones that tend to show up much more often, but we also, if we look across the entire width and breadth of fairy lore and folklore and stories and anecdotal accounts, there's really no limit to either what the ones that can shapeshift could potentially do, or what the just types of animals that exist in fairy are. So just be careful not to pigeonhole it in your own mind, that if it doesn't look like a cat, or a dog, or a deer, or etc., then it can't be something of fairy. because it can be. They can kind of be anything. We're just going to be discussing the more popular ones. So the specific one that was asked in the question was deer, hind specifically, which would be a term for a female deer. We do see different accounts in folklore, often connected to white deer, sometimes just to what seemingly look like an ordinary deer, but that's not acting like a normal deer would. And again, this is where those fuzzy categories come in. There clearly are fairy deer. There's references to them being hunted in some stories. They show up occasionally. So we know that there are deer that exist in fairy that are just kind of like human deer, except magical-ish. But we also have quite a body of folklore relating to beings who either voluntarily or involuntarily are shape-shifted into deer. So, for example, Finn's wife, Sav, she was shape-shifted into a deer by a sort of dark magician, we'll say, who had wanted her to marry him. She refused. She ended up with Finn McCool instead, and then ended up turned back into a deer by turned into a deer by this dark magician who was punishing her for not choosing him. Finn ends up tracking her down in her deer form, but he's unable to rescue her in the version of the story I'm familiar with, but finds that she's had a son while she was in this deer form. The son, however, is human in appearance and is named Oshin, which means little deer. So, and then he becomes sort of one of the most famous characters in the Finnian or Oshinic cycle of Irish myth. So that's one example of sort of a unwilling transformation into deer. But this idea that deer are not always what they appear to be is something we find quite a bit in mythology. There's also accounts in the story of Thomas Ercildoune, the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, where the fairy queen does, of course, at the end of the ballad, return Thomas to the human world. There's quite a bit of folklore, though, that sort of picks up where the official written stories leave off, that says that the queen had always said that she would return for him, and that when he was a little bit older, after he'd lived a bit of his life in the human world, someone came and told him that there was a stag and a hind, a male and female deer, who had come into town and were not acting quite right. And he immediately knew that they had been sent to guide him back, to take him back to the fairy realm. And he followed them and left and was never seen in the human world again. So that's just another example. We see deer appearing quite a lot in stories where they are leading people or guiding people to places they need to be, leading people to particular encounters. Finn finds his son Oshin because a deer leads his hounds to the boy, basically. Again, in one of the versions. There's multiple versions of most of these stories, I want to be clear. But so we do see deer as important in folklore and fairy lore and mythology connected to them. Usually leading people someplace, not always, sometimes being hunted, and sometimes as this involuntary transformation, people are sort of put into this shape. Involuntary transformation to animal shapes is a really major theme in a lot of Irish mythology. It's something we see repeatedly, so that's not super weird to see it with the deer. We also see, sort of on the same vein, swans are very significant. There used to be, I assume there still is, a prohibition against hunting or killing swans, because the belief was that swans were often not what they appeared to be. That it might look like a swan, but you could never know for sure that it actually was a swan. I sort of strongly suspect the folk ballad Molly Bawn is based on this idea. And that's a song about a hunter who's out hunting, sees what he thinks is a swan, sort of taking refuge under this bush in bad weather, shoots it, and then goes over and realizes that it's actually the girl that he was in love with, that she had wrapped her white mantle around herself, and that he had mistaken her for a swan and shot her and killed her. It's a very sad song. But I think that sort of has an older resonance in it to this idea that when you shoot a swan, you might not actually be shooting a swan. You might be shooting something or someone who's been shapeshifted or put into that form. Obviously, the Children of Lear is one of the most well-known stories about people forced into the shape of swans. It's the 4 children of the Irish god Lear. Their jealous stepmother originally was going to kill them and then changes her mind and instead traps them in the form of swans for 900 years. And they get to spend 300 here and then 300 there and then 300 in another location. But again, it's an example of this forced into this shape sort of transformation magic. And the swans are not always what they appear to be. In the story of Angus's dream, the myth of Angus's dream, Angus, who is one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, he's technically an Irish god, although he lives in the Sidhe, falls in love with this woman. He eventually, with the help of his mother and his father, Dagda and the Buin, tracks her down. It turns out she is a woman of the Sidhe. Her father is a king of the Sidhe. And she spends a certain amount of time in the form of a swan and a certain amount of time in the form of a maiden. And he goes and finds her on the shore of a lake. She is with her, I think it's like 150 attendants, who are also all in the form of swans. He goes and meets her, basically convinces her to marry him, and then the 2 of them in the form of swans take flight and circle 3 times around the area. Their song lulls everyone to sleep. So, again, just more emphasizing this swan connection with fairy and this idea that swans are not always what they appear to be. We, of course, have specific types of fairies who are known as a particular animal, so like the Cat Sìth. Fairy cats are getting more well known. I find more people have heard of those now. They're basically in the folklore, and this would be Scottish and Irish mostly, they are dog-sized black cats with a single white spot on the center of the chest. There is a tiny bit of folklore that's a little more positive about them that suggests if you leave some milk out for them, particularly on Samhain, Halloween, that they can be a little more benevolent towards you, but the majority of folklore connected to them is a little less pleasant. They are in the form of a cat. They are generally thought to be shapeshifted. Some people believe they're shapeshifted witches, some people believe they're shapeshifted fairies. After a certain number of transformations, they are thought to permanently stay in that cat form. There's a lot of wake traditions that are based around keeping the Cat Sìth away because it would either take or consume the soul of the recently deceased. It had this particular amount of time that it was able to do this, which is why you had to guard the body for a certain amount of time after death until the soul organically left. Otherwise, this Cat Sìth, this fairy cat, would come in and take the soul. So there's quite a few different traditions around making sure that didn't happen. They're just generally not seen as a super positive thing to be seeing or to have around. There's protections against them, that sort of thing. And also, of course, they're not small. It's a dog-sized cat. They're very big. We do also see some stories relating to cats and fairies in some other ways. The fairy queen Eivil was said to be forcibly transformed into a white cat by her sister Cleana. So We do have sort of that aspect to it. I mean, anyone who's ever been around a cat, I think you can kind of understand why they would have this natural association to things of fairy, because they're just very interesting creatures. So reading an article recently that there's some evidence that cats probably domesticated themselves, that they just decided domestication was probably a better deal for them, and that does not surprise me at all. It sort of sums up cats. We also, of course, have fairy dogs or fairy hounds, Cúisí. We see Cúisí in Irish, Scottish, and Welsh folklore. They do vary between the different regions. So if you really want to look into the fairy hounds, I recommend picking a specific type of area to focus on. Fairy hounds in Ireland are not quite the same as fairy hounds in Scotland, who are not quite the same as fairy hounds in Wales. And then, of course, in England, there's quite a lot of lore around black dogs, and those can sometimes be fairies and sometimes not be fairies, and that's a whole big subject on its own. So if that particular thing interests you, I recommend looking more into that specifically. I don't have time in this video to really get into all of the lore that we have relating to fairy hounds. I will quickly say that much like fairy cats are thought to be dog-sized, fairy hounds, particularly the Scottish ones, are thought to be the size of a calf, a baby cow. They are usually dark black or, sorry, black is already dark. That was redundant. They're usually thought to be black or dark green. That makes more sense. However, if we look at fairy hounds in Wales, they're often described, or at least, a significant amount of the time described as being white with red eyes and red ears. They're particularly associated, the Cuanún, that's what they're called in Welsh. They're particularly associated with sort of around or Gwyneth Neath, the gods or the kings of fairy in Wales, sort of as hunting hounds. The Welsh equivalent of the wild hunt sort of features the Cuanún. So they are, again, probably not something you super want to be seeing. Not that there might not be more positive folklore around them as well. Just particularly the white ones, generally not a good thing to see. Not that the Scottish ones are great to see either. Fairy hounds in general have a very mixed mythology. They can be positive. There are stories and anecdotes of them guarding people, protecting travelers from highwaymen, that kind of thing. There's also, however, quite a lot of folklore and mythology around them that associates them as omens of death, that they would show up, a person would see them right before the person died or took ill. So they have that sort of layer to them. The Irish ones, which I said at the beginning, are a little bit different. Some of the Cúisí in Ireland are, a Cúisí in Ireland, I should say, would be known in many cases to guard treasure or to guard a specific fairy hill or a specific location. I do have friends who have had modern day encounters with a Cúisí in Ireland. I can think of at least two off the top of my head that have. In one case, the Cúisí in question sort of appeared out of nowhere when a friend was talking about not being able to find her way, and the dog literally led her to where she needed to be, which was in fact an archaeological site. In the second case, the friend similarly was visiting a different archaeological site in Ireland, and this dog appeared out of nowhere and sort of escorted him through. In both cases, there didn't seem to be any humans around. The dog didn't seem to belong there. It appeared out of nowhere. It disappeared again at the end. So that's sort of a Cúisí kind of thing. So, those are examples of what the Cúisí are and sort of how they act. They can't be good, they can't be bad. Generally, when it comes to fairy animals, and I'll mention this particularly because we're talking about modern encounters with the fairy hounds, I have had several myself here in the US, but again, I don't want to make this video just about Kushi. When we're talking about them, they can be helpful, they can be dangerous, the folklore varies a lot. It's sort of best to keep in mind that you sort of have to decide for yourself how the energy around it feels. I don't know how else to explain that. The good rule of thumb to decide, is this random dog a human world dog, not a human world dog? My friends and I have the thing we sort of jokingly refer to, is it dogging correctly? Is it acting the way you would expect a dog to act? You can apply this across the board with any sort of animal, except really cats and sheep, because cats and sheep are very contradictory by nature. It's very hard to know if they're acting correctly or not. But other types of animals, do they seem to be acting the way you would expect that sort of animal to act? And not in a, it might be rabid kind of way, but just behaviorally. If it does, if it is, then it's probably fine. If it appears right when you ask for directions or help getting somewhere, it literally takes you to that place that you were looking for and then disappears again, that's not really a typical human world dog thing to do. So, for one example. We also do see examples with the Kushi where they are not actually animals, but they are fairies or some form of people transformed. Finn McCool was well known to have his 2 hunting hounds, Brown and Skolon. They were actually his nephews. His sister had been transformed against her will into the shape of a dog because of a jealous rivalry with another woman over a guy. She was pregnant when she was transformed. Unlike Sav, she did not give birth to a human child. She gave birth to 2 puppies. And these puppies should have been human children, basically, but they were not. They were born into dog form, and they then stayed with their uncle for their lives and acted as hunting hounds. So we do see cases where fairy dogs are not actually dogs. They're something shapeshifted. And again, there are several types of shapeshifting fairies that can take that form. We also, of course, have the Ethwiski, the water horse, or Kelpie. The water horses and Kelpies are different things, but they're very similar in nature and description, so I have a bad habit of lumping them together. But for our purposes here, they are both horse-shaped fairies. They can transform and take a humanoid form, as well as the horse form. They can either appear as a very light-colored, like white or gray horse, or a black horse. They live in bodies of water. They generally eat people. That's what they do. They drown them and eat them. But they are, despite looking like a horse, it's better to think of them as a humanoid formed being who can take the shape of a horse. They're very canny and clever and dangerous. So we do have those. And of course there's other types of fairy horses as well. There's many types of fairy horses that are just horses from fairy. And we see that in a ton of the mythology when we talk about the fairy raid, which is sort of parade or procession that the fairies will do when they're moving their homes from one fairy hill to another. They do ride on horses. We see multiple accounts of fairies appearing, riding a horse. These are horses. They are just horses of fairy. They are not fairies shapeshifted. They are not human level, again, for lack of a better term, they're not human level intelligence in a horse's body. They're just a horse that is from fairy. We also see multiple Irish deities that have particular magic horses or horses that have a particular magical power, but they're still just horses. if that makes sense to everyone. We see the same thing with cows, fairy cows. There's many references in them. They actually feature a lot, particularly in Welsh fairy lore. But they're still generally just cows or bulls. But they have some magical nature to them. In Ireland, fairy cows, these magical cows, usually can give an abundance of milk that will feed armies. That shows up in several different places. There's more than one of those. We also see these magical bulls. There's at least one case that I can think of offhand of fairy cows that are not actually cows, and that is the story of the disagreement of the two swineherds, which basically these two fairy kings each had a swineherd, a pig keeper, who kept their herd of pigs. The two pig keepers got into, they were originally friends, but they started to get into this rivalry, and the rivalry was taking a toll on the pigs, basically. In trying to prove which one of them was the best pig keeper, they kept messing up each other's pigs. And the fairy kings finally had enough of this and told them it had to stop. And because the enmity had gotten to the point it had gotten to, they were cursed to take different forms in successive lifetimes. So they went through all of these different transformations. They were worms, they were dragons, they were specters, they were stags, but finally they end up in the form of bulls. And one is Fenbedach, the white-horned bull, and the other is the Don Cooley, the brown bull of Cooley, and that is sort of the entire premise of the Ulster cycle, and the Tonpo Cooley, the cattle raid of Cooley, entirely comes about fighting over these bulls, and, well, slightly more nuanced than that, but fighting over these bulls who are not actually bulls. They're actually fairy men, who have been forced into this shape to atone for this long ago rivalry. So that's at least one example of that. And as I just referenced, we do know from that there are pigs in fairy. I talked about that a little earlier too, but that's another place where they come up, and they're just pigs. They're pigs that live in fairy. Birds, multiple different kinds of birds that get mentioned, different, not swan specific, but birds in general. Different beings who take the shape of birds, who are associated with birds. Clina, for example, is connected to birds. Abel is also connected to birds in a different way. Wrens come up with that. Aoife, who's another goddess / fairy queen, she's connected to cranes in the crane bag, but she's shape-shifted into a crane for a period of time. So we see all these different layers and layers of folklore and mythology and anecdotal accounts even that are connected to animals and fairy. And, to kind of wrap this up, I just want to reiterate that we do have these two fuzzy categories. Animals that are from fairy, and fairies who are shape-shifted into animals. And those are slightly different. If you're encountering an animal that is just an animal from fairy, they do have magical properties to them and qualities. They can be destructive, they can be dangerous, but they're still really just animals. Sort of epic, powerful animals, but they're still animals. They're not exceptionally intelligent or thoughtful or communicative beyond what you'd expect a pig or a cow or a deer or a horse to be. When we're talking about fairies who are shape-shifted, that is a completely different thing. And we really are looking at material that is talking about beings that are as intelligent or are more intelligent than we would expect humans to be, but have this other form. And there's pitfalls with both of these when you're reading the material. If you're putting too much anthropomorphism into the animal fairies, then that can be a problem. You're expecting too much intelligence and agency from them. On the other hand, if you're taking away too much anthropomorphism from the fairies who are shapeshifted into animals, that can cause a lot of problems too, because then you are going to be really underestimating what they can do or what they will do, and that does cause people problems in folklore and in stories. The main way that kelpies and water horses hunt is tricking people into riding them. Once you get on, particularly the kelpies, once you get on, you get physically stuck to them. You can't move your hand, you can't get off, and then they take you into the water and drown you and eat you. So you can't just assume because it looks like a horse that it's just a horse. This has gone a lot longer than I intended it to go, so I just want to wrap it up. I hope that at least quickly covers a couple different types of fairy animals and sort of what we know about them, what we know about those two fuzzy categories, how they overlap sometimes, and just gives you all an idea of how complicated this folklore and this fairy lore can be on the subject of fairy animals. Again, and as always, any questions, pop them in the comments and I will try to get to them. I hope that was at least a little bit educational, and I will try to make another video soon. Have a great day.